Baby Truc Lam's clothes, milk bottles, and tiny daily items were scattered everywhere, and her dad suddenly realized she didn't even have a space of her own. After feeding her, Trieu Duong quietly decided to build a small cabinet just for her, something clean, safe, and truly hers. But can something this simple hold all the love he wants to give his little girl? Subscribe and leave a comment if you love warm father-daughter stories like this. The morning started quietly, wrapped in a soft, gentle light that slipped through the window and settled across the small room. It was the kind of calm that only existed in moments shared between a father and his baby daughter. Peaceful, warm, and full of quiet love. Dad Trieu Duong sat on the mat, carefully holding baby Truc Lam in his arms. She was so small, resting comfortably against him, her tiny body fitting perfectly within his embrace. In his hand was a milk bottle, tilted just enough for her to drink with ease. "Slowly, my little girl. Don't rush," he whispered, his voice low and soothing. Truc Lam drank quietly, her soft eyes occasionally looking up at him, as if checking whether he was still there. And every time their eyes met, Trieu Duong would gently smile, reassuring her without saying a word. Because she didn't need words. She just needed him, his presence, his protection, his warmth. When she finished drinking, he carefully lifted her upright, supporting her head against his shoulder. "All right, time to burp," he said softly. His hand moved gently along her back, patting slowly, patiently. He had learned this rhythm over time, not perfectly, but with care. After a few seconds, a small burp escaped, and his face immediately softened. "There we go. Good girl," he murmured. He didn't put her down right away. Instead, he held her a little longer, because in that moment, she felt unbelievably small. And he felt an overwhelming need to protect her from everything in the world. After a while, he gently placed her back on the mat. She stretched her arms, her tiny fingers opening and closing as if she was reaching for something invisible. Her legs kicked lightly, full of quiet energy. Trieu Duong stayed beside her for a few seconds, watching, making sure she was comfortable, making sure she was safe. Only then did he slowly stand up. He began to tidy up the small space around him, putting away the milk bottle, folding a cloth, adjusting the blanket. Everything he did was simple, but careful, because now, every small detail mattered. But then, his eyes drifted toward the corner of the room, and he stopped. There was a chair with a small pile of baby clothes stacked on top. A thin rope tied from one side of the wall to the other, holding a few tiny shirts and pants. Some clothes were clean, some were slightly wrinkled, some were waiting to be folded. It wasn't messy in a careless way. It was the kind of arrangement you make when you don't have enough, but still try your best. Still, something about it didn't sit right with him. He walked closer, slowly, quietly. He reached out and picked up one of Truc Lam's shirts. It was small, so small it barely filled his hands. Soft fabric, light color. He gently smoothed it out with his fingers, careful not to wrinkle it again. And that's when the thought became clear. She doesn't even have her own place. His voice was barely above a whisper. He looked around again. There was no small cabinet, no shelf, no proper space that belonged only to her. Everything was temporary. Everything was for now. He turned his head and looked back at Truc Lam. She was lying there peacefully, her eyes wandering around the room, completely unaware. And somehow, that made his chest tighten, because she trusted him, without knowing anything. She trusted that everything around her would be enough, that she would always be safe, that she would always be cared for. Trieu Duong took a slow breath, and in that quiet moment, something inside him shifted. No, this isn't enough for my daughter. He walked back to her and knelt down. His hand gently touched her small forehead, brushing away a strand of soft hair. "Hey, my little girl," he whispered. Her eyes turned toward him instantly, calm, bright, full of trust. "You should have your own place, a proper one." She didn't understand the words, but she watched him, listened to his voice, felt his presence, and that was enough. Trieu Duong smiled softly, but there was something new behind that smile. Determination, a quiet promise. "Don't worry, Dad will make it for you." Later that morning, after making sure she was comfortable and safe, Trieu Duong stepped outside into the yard. The air was fresh, carrying the faint scent of wood and earth. Around him were simple tools and leftover pieces of wood he had saved over time. Nothing expensive, nothing perfect, but to him, they were enough. Stood there for a moment thinking. Not about something big, not about something complicated, just something meaningful. A small clothes cabinet, maybe a hanging shelf, he said quietly. Not too tall, not too wide, just right for her tiny clothes. Just enough to give her a space of her own. He began sorting through the wood pieces, lifting each one, checking carefully. Some were too rough, some were uneven, but he didn't rush, because this wasn't just building furniture. This was building something for his daughter. Every piece had to be right. Every detail had to be safe. After selecting a few suitable pieces, he placed them neatly on the ground and picked up his tools. They were worn, but strong, just like him. He started measuring, cutting, shaping. Each movement was steady and focused. Inside the house, Truc Lam made a soft sound, almost like she was calling for him. He paused immediately, put down his tools, and walked back inside. He didn't wait for her to cry louder. He didn't wait for her to need him more. He simply came back, because that's what being her father meant now. Being there, before she even had to ask. He picked her up gently. "I'm here. You're safe," he whispered. Her body relaxed instantly in his arms. Her tiny hand rested against his chest, and for a moment, nothing else mattered again. He carried her outside with him, holding her securely with one arm. With the other hand, he gently pointed toward the wooden pieces. "See that? Dad is making something for you." His voice was soft, protective, full of warmth. She looked in that direction, her eyes wide and curious. She didn't understand the words, but she felt the love behind them. He carefully placed her in a safe spot nearby. Soft cloth beneath her, shaded from the sun. Everything arranged so she would be comfortable and protected. Then he returned to his work. But now, everything felt different. Now he wasn't just building, he was doing it with her beside him. For her, with her watching. He worked more carefully, measured more precisely, smoothed every surface with extra attention, because this wasn't just about making something useful. It had to be safe, gentle, worthy of her. Every few moments, he would glance over at her, just to check, just to make sure she was still okay, still comfortable, still safe. And every time he saw her there, his heart softened, and his hands worked even more carefully. The sun slowly rose higher. The frame of the small cabinet began to take shape. Simple, humble, but filled with meaning. He ran his hand along the wood and found a rough edge. Immediately, he picked up sandpaper and began smoothing it down slowly. "No sharp edges. Not for my little girl," he murmured, because one day, her tiny hands might touch this. And he wanted that touch to always feel safe. He stepped back and looked at what he had built so far. Not finished yet, but already something real, something meaningful. Then he looked at Truc Lam again, still there, still watching, still trusting him completely. And in that moment, he understood something deeply. This wasn't just a place for her clothes. This was a space that said, "You are protected. You are cared for. You are loved," in every small detail. He took a deep breath, picked up his tools again, and continued, because he wasn't done yet. Not until everything was ready. Not until his daughter had something truly her own. The afternoon light grew softer, stretching long shadows across the yard as Trieu Duong continued working on the small cabinet. The structure was already standing, simple, sturdy, and shaped with intention. But to him, it still wasn't finished. Not yet, because this wasn't just about completing something. It was about making sure everything was right for his daughter. He picked up a small wooden bar, the piece that would hold her tiny clothes. Holding it in his hands, he paused for a moment, imagining how it would look once everything was done. Little shirts, soft dresses, tiny pants, all hanging neatly in one place, a space that belonged only to her. He gently fixed the bar into place, adjusting it carefully, making sure it was strong enough to hold, but smooth enough to be safe. Every movement was slow, precise, filled with quiet care. Behind him, baby Truc Lam made a soft sound. He turned immediately. She was still lying on the cloth, her eyes moving, her small hands waving gently in the air. The breeze brushed lightly across her face and she blinked slowly, calm and peaceful. Trieu Duong walked over and knelt beside her. "Hey, are you watching me?" he asked softly. She responded with a tiny movement, her fingers reaching outward as if trying to touch him. He smiled, his heart softening instantly. "I'm almost done. Just a little more, okay?" Of course, she didn't understand the words, but she felt his presence, and that was enough. He gently adjusted the cloth beneath her, making sure it was still soft and comfortable, making sure nothing around her could hurt her, always checking, always protecting. Then he stood up and returned to his work. Now came the final steps, the ones that mattered the most. He picked up sandpaper again and began smoothing every surface, each corner, each edge, each small detail that might be overlooked by others, but never by him. Because this was for Truc Lam, because her safety came before everything. His hands moved slowly along the wood, feeling for anything rough, anything sharp, anything that didn't belong. When he found even the smallest imperfection, he fixed it immediately. "No, this has to be perfect for you," he whispered. "Not perfect in appearance, but perfect in care." After finishing the smoothing, he took a clean cloth and wiped away the dust. The wood now looked softer, warmer, almost like it carried a part of him within it. He stepped back, looked at the small cabinet. A quiet breath escaped his chest. It was done. Simple, humble, but strong, safe, and built with all the love he had. He turned to Truc Lam again. She was still there, watching, her eyes calm and curious. Trieu Duong walked over, gently picked her up, and held her close. "It's ready," he said softly, his voice almost like a whisper meant only for her. He carried her toward the cabinet, slowly, carefully, as if this moment mattered more than anything else. Inside the house, he placed her gently on the mat nearby, within his reach, within his sight. Then he turned and brought in the small cabinet. He set it down in a quiet corner of the room. Not too far, not too close. Just the right place. A place where she would grow, where she would see it every day, where it would quietly become a part of her life. He went back to the chair and picked up her clothes, one by one, carefully, each piece held gently in his hands, as if they were something precious, because they were. He started with a small shirt. He smoothed it out with his fingers, making sure there were no wrinkles. Then slowly, gently, he hung it onto the wooden bar. He paused for a moment after placing it, just looking, just feeling. Then another piece, a tiny pair of pants, then a soft dress, each one placed with care, each one adjusted slightly, making sure it hung neatly, making sure it looked right, but more importantly, making sure it felt right. Truc Lam lay nearby, watching quietly. Her eyes followed his movements. She didn't understand what he was doing, but she felt the calm, the warmth, the sense of something new. As more clothes filled the small cabinet, the corner of the room began to change. It no longer felt temporary. It no longer felt like just for now. It felt complete. It felt like something belonged there, because it did. Trieu Duong stepped back again. This time he didn't just see a cabinet. He saw a space for his daughter, a space that said, "These are yours. You have a place here. You are cared for in every small detail." He walked back to her and sat down beside her. Gently, he reached out and adjusted the sleeve of her tiny shirt. "Look, these are all yours now," he whispered. She blinked slowly, her small hand brushing against his. And in that simple touch, something inside him softened even more. He didn't need her to understand. He didn't need her to say anything, because love like this didn't need words. He stayed there, for a while, sitting beside her, one hand resting gently near her, always ready, always present, always protecting. The light in the room grew warmer as the sun slowly began to set, and in that quiet moment, everything felt right. Trieu Duong looked at the small cabinet one last time, then back at Truc Lam. And a quiet thought settled deeply in his heart. It wasn't about how big the cabinet was. It wasn't about how perfect it looked. It was about this. From now on, even the smallest things in her life would have a place, would be cared for, would be protected, just like her. He gently lifted her into his arms again, holding her close against his chest. "You don't have to worry about anything," he whispered softly. "Dad is here." Outside, the light slowly faded. Inside, the small room felt warmer than ever, because now there was not just a father, not just a daughter, but a space built from love, a space that would quietly grow with her, day by day. And even though she was still too small to understand, one day she would. One day she would look back and feel it, the care, the protection, the love that had always been there from the very beginning. After feeding baby Truc Lam, Trieu Duong begins to notice something that quietly troubles him. Her clothes, milk bottles, and personal items are scattered around the room without a proper place. Though everything is kept as clean as possible, nothing truly belongs to her. Realizing this, he decides to build a small clothes cabinet with his own hands, creating a safe and organized space just for his daughter. Throughout the day, he carefully selects wood, measures, cuts, and smooths every detail, always keeping her safety in mind. With Truc Lam watching nearby, the cabinet slowly takes shape. In the end, he gently hangs her tiny clothes, turning a simple corner into something meaningful. A space filled with care, protection, and a father's quiet, unconditional love.